Welcome everyone to another session of our Performance and Sports Science Study Group webinars. My name is Daniel Yu. I am the sports scientist for the Orlando Magic, and my co-host is...
How's it going, everyone? My name is Nick Simi. I'm the head athletic trainer and physical therapist for the Grand Rapids Gold in the G League for the Denver Nuggets.
And together, we're just super excited to have Brett and Alex present to you guys today. They're going to be going over energy profiling in MMA fighters. Both of them work as the sports science and SNC coordinator, respectively, for the UFC Performance Institute. This is such an incredible opportunity to learn from them on how fighting sport athletes are trained and profiled. And I know a lot of our previous talks have been for team sport athletes as well. So this is a really great, unique aspect to look at. If you have any questions at any point, feel free to put them in the chat and we'll moderate them. After the presentation, we'll open it up for a Q&A as well. And without further ado, I'll hand it over to Brett and Alex.
Cool. Yeah, nice to meet everybody. This is a really exciting topic. Because definitely for the inspiration around the certification of that the NSA push out, and then ultimately just kind of getting everybody together and really just trying to understand how the sports science department intertwines here at the UFC can be very different for how you guys as sports scientists interact with your athletes in your sports and so forth. So really excited about just kind of showing you guys what it is we do here, how we kind of collaborate and so forth, and just kind of really help you guys understand the environment and how we use our energy system profiling for our fighters.
Awesome. And hello, everyone. My name is Alexander Sauza. Definitely super excited to be on this webinar with you guys today, just talking about, like Brett mentioned, our energy system profiling. For myself as the strength and conditioning coordinator, it's definitely helpful to have somebody like Brett around who's really proficient in running and analyzing the tests and then being able to just bounce ideas off. And I feel like that's what makes groups like this so valuable, is that, you know, it expands your network and you're able to kind of network and meet other people in the profession and just see what other people are doing and how they're utilizing their tests, and kind of just spark and give you guys some new ideas around not just energy system profiling, but just even looking at how to manage some of your data.
Awesome. So we'll just jump right in. Maybe, hopefully we'll give it a shot. There we go. Cool. So kind of the idea is to kind of cover like 5 bullet points across the presentation today. Really just that holistic approach to athlete preparation through strength and power, through body composition, energy system profiling, so forth. Yes, we will spend almost 100% of this talking about energy system profiling, what that means to us, and what the training recommendations are based off of that. But it's important, I think, to note with everybody is where it actually fits into that athlete preparation and how this is just a piece of the puzzle and it's not just everything and all of that. And then the key principles of, the energy system profiling analysis itself, as it's related to our MMA fighters at the UFC, and then specifically our UFC Performance Institute protocols themselves around the profiling. We have 3 specific ones that we use for what we call our tier 1, kind of our screening perspective, with immediate metabolic power, short-term metabolic power, long-term metabolic power. We have a 4th one that's more around like fight camp analysis, and I'll touch on briefly, but we won't go too much into that, as this will be a lot longer than an hour presentation. And then we'll talk about training recommendations for development, and this is where kind of Alex spends 99% of his time on taking this information and then piecing it together along with that strength and power testing and that. And then we'll have our future directions, which ultimately helps you guys understand and where we sit down and go, okay, well, here's our current procedures and our current screening, but then ultimately, like, where are we also striving to go? Because we have a unique setting with our fighters themselves, and the sport itself being as how it is and what technology we can and can't use in competition versus some other sports. So ultimately, really excited to kind of dive into a lot of this, but give you guys a really good understanding of kind of all the pieces to the puzzle.
Okay, y'all. So this next slide here, we're looking at just an example of our athlete performance profile. So you can see our energy system profiling on the left and our strength and power on the right. But before we get there, for those of you that aren't too familiar with the UFC Performance Institute, outside of sports science and strength conditioning, we have 3 other major departments that we work with really closely, and that would include our sports dietitians, our sports medicine team, and our sports psychology team. Speaking on our sports medicine and sports dietitian team, they also have what is considered their tier 1 diagnostics, whether that be body composition analysis, RMR analysis, and then an orthopedic screening, and then a neurocognitive screening for our sports medicine team as well. Once our athletes are checked off on all of those boxes, that's where, for Brett and I, a lot of the fun stuff kind of gets to get kicked in from the performance side. So just speaking from the strength and power chart on that right-hand side, we're looking at our 4 main tier 1 tests that our athletes will go through. That includes an isometric mid-thigh pull, a load velocity profile for both the lower body and upper body, one using the counter movement jump. The other is a test that Brett came up with, which is a jammer punch throw. And then our last tier 1 test is our neck profiling test, our neck strength test that we actually do on the valid force frame.
And so yeah, the idea behind this, and this is just think of it on a scale of 1 to 100, right? I won't dive too much into like every single aspect of this, but really just help you guys understand that our energy system profiling is obviously a piece to the puzzle. But ultimately what you're trying to look at when you do any profiling, any testing, any diagnostics or anything is to assess what their strengths and weaknesses are. What are our true limitations, right? So our strength and power, this athlete here, the weight class is right at a little bit around 50 percentile, which makes sense. Athlete says the strength and power profile itself at an 85 percentile. So ultimately it's telling us, it's kind of checking the box that just around upper body, lower body, total body strength, everything is good and ready to go, right? He is strong, he's fast, he's explosive. I mean, this athlete is one big person, one big explosive individual. Whereas you see on the energy system profiling with our immediate power, that long-term and that short-term power test there is some limitations there. And believe it or not, we picked on this athlete because of his lack in his ability and his energy systems. It kind of makes a fun presentation to really just dive into the energy system profiling itself, to just go, okay, well, where his limitations are actually a little bit more around the metabolic conditioning, that long-term, that short-term power development. And so we're going to talk around how we actually do that from an SNC sports science aspect. Maybe. There we go. So kind of the key principles for our energy system profiling, right? So like all of you know, or at least I would expect you guys to know now, is we have our 3 energy systems, our alactic system, our anaerobic system, and our aerobic energy system. Don't all work intertwinedly with each other. There is kind of that interplay between all 3 of them, depending on the intensity and the duration of the specific task that we're trying to do. But kind of underneath that is the concepts that we're really trying to help everybody understand around power, capacity, efficiency, and flexibility. And each system has its own characteristics of how we actually build those aspects and what actually is limiting along with that fighter, right? So they could have the capacity and the efficiency to complete the task, but they just don't have that power that's associated to the alactic system or the anaerobic system, right? And so how do we fit this into our programming piece? And each one has its own little nicks and crannies of how we get it done. But then this other piece is that flexibility. As I talked about, is we have that interplay between all of the energy systems. And so your ability to flex between those energy systems is extremely important across pretty much any sport, but especially around what we do, right? Their ability to have those high intensity exchanges in the fight, and then next thing you know, you go into an anaerobic effort where you're fighting for a takedown for 20 to 15 or 15 to 20 seconds. And you have to have that ability to shift an energy system without putting a massive impact on your performance. So there's kind of those aspects around it. So we'll touch a lot and we'll spend a lot of time on the concepts around power, capacity, efficiency, and flexibility. But outside of that, we look at those parameters, we assess the limitations, understand that component, but we compare those to the weight class norms. So each person is going to be compared to the peers that they are going to be fighting. Makes a lot of sense. Comparing a lightweight to a featherweight really doesn't make too many sense. But at the same time, you really want to understand who this athlete is, what the weight class is actually doing, and where they need to spend or prioritize most of their time, right? Heavyweights, believe it or not, don't have very good conditioning, right? We're not going to spend a whole lot of building that conditioning aspect. But at the same time, if the average is a certain specific level of fitness or a certain level of conditioning, we need to make sure that they're at least at that average standpoint so that we can still develop that strength and power on the other side of it. And then prioritization. So really prioritize what's important for that fighter in their in specific training phase, or how long it will actually take for them to build those energy systems. If it's through alactic intervals, and they really need to spend a lot of time developing that, then it's going to take a good 6-7 weeks. Whereas if we need to improve our aerobic system, we could potentially do that in 4 to 6 weeks during fight camp to help that push that along. So depending on where they're at in their training camp, and that will really help us understand and prioritize what's important and how much time it will actually take to do that task. So quickly, I do want to kind of big explanation of what our actual energy systems are, like our energy system testing and profiling. So we have 3 tests across the board. That's gonna talk about singular test to only focus on one specific energy system, but they all interplay with each other. So it's kind of counterintuitive, but ultimately the one that's dominating the most. So we have our immediate energy system, and that's our 6-second sprint test, right? So everything's done on the assault bike here at the UFC. We'll sit down. We do 3 6-second sprints at maximal effort with 2 minutes recovery in between, ultimately assessing their power output and then how fast they can recover from that. We're wearing heart rate monitor. We have a mask. We have kind of a gas analysis to really understand VO2, VOCO2, RER, ventilation, all that jazz, right? And then the other piece is that we have some sensors on the muscles as well, to look at hemodynamics, to get into a little bit more around like blood flow and understand oxygen delivery and transportation and so forth in the actual muscles that are working. So in the arms and the legs. So here, first and foremost, is actually looking at power itself, because we need to understand what the work is being done. We'll look at the physiological cost of each energy system and what is required for that power output. But here we're actually diving into, okay, well, here's the power output, and then on these later slides, we'll actually look at the physiological cost that's associated to it. So we have the 6-second sprint. We have this 60-second all-out test, where it's exactly what it is. You get on the bike and you tell them to sell their soul for 60 seconds and see what happens after the fact. Really just trying to maximize the glycolytic pathways, which will ultimately help us understand, their ability to, one, handle fatigue, but also recover from that aspect of it. And then, like everybody knows, the VO2 max tests are it's a roughly 8 to 10 minute ramp test, starting at a slower speed, increasing every minute until like full exhaustion, and then a 3-minute recovery within that. So that helps us understand, one, their ability to generate power, which will be maximal power output, and then their ability to sustain and kind of endure on the other spectrum, really looking at the alactic system all the way to the aerobic system and kind of what's dominating and what's kind of going on within that power output, and then the physiological cost that goes within that. So here we'll actually specifically focus on one athlete through this entire presentation, so you guys kind of really get a good understanding of going, okay, well, you have one athlete case, what does it actually look like? What's he telling us? And so forth. And that's kind of the idea. So with our 6-second test, first and foremost, looking at the power output, he's above our average. We can take that as a good spot. Highest maximal power output amongst all 3 energy systems, significantly above the average and close to the maximal for the weight class. Then we have our short-term power, which is the lowest result among the energy systems, and below the weight class average, identifying a deficiency here. Right, so he's sitting right below. Something's going on within that minute to indicate that there is a low power output, and we need to address what is going on. 8-minute test, slightly below the average, But there's more development around the short-term energy system, which could potentially aid and improve this long-term test. Because this is the biggest drop-off, we are going to prioritize and put a lot of emphasis on how that looks from a training perspective and an energy system development component. But like I said before, we're going to kind of touch on each of these aspects. So we have the immediate energy system profiling. So we're looking at that 6-second sprint. Right away, we have a max sprint. You can tell, just like you saw before, his power output is right above the average, sitting in a very good spot. Relative to his weight and his weight class, you can still see he's sitting at that above the average, right? So some of these guys, if they're bigger, right, they're able to generate more power. Yep, that makes sense. So we compare everything to their weight and then compare it to their weight class. That will help us obviously understand that relative score and making sure that we can compare all of the people in the weight class. So power output, we could tick the box. Now, underneath that, you have our functional systems with our cardiac, our respiratory, metabolic, and musculature systems. We want to tick the box on each of those aspects, right? Like I said before, we wear a heart rate monitor, we wear a gas analysis, we wear our train reds, and that's our near infrared spectroscopy. So within that, we can look at our cardiac performance, which will be exactly right here. And so you can see his average max heart rate is right at the average for the weight class, right? So it doesn't cost his heart a whole lot to produce that amount of output. These are very good signs that his heart isn't working in overdrive to deliver that high intensity burst that we're looking for. But then we have this recovery modality that is slightly lower than the weight class average. So that is a deficiency that we're looking at, right? So his heart rate recovery is a little bit slower relative to the weight division and something that we can prioritize. One thing that we don't highlight too much in our performance meetings and our communication with our fighters right now is the respiratory and metabolic performance in the alactic system test itself. Right now, it's more of a true understanding of what is going on and what is delayed and what is causing any residual fatigue or improvements through that. So we haven't put too much effort into throwing that onto some of these slides and really putting into it, as it's more a little internal. So nothing specified here, but then we look at our musculature performance. And so train red is really a near infrared spectroscopy shooting a light into it's a U-shaped light going to the muscle, back to a receiver to really try to understand the amount of oxygen that's in the muscle at any given time. Right. So if you do a massive contraction or a massive intensity, you'll see a drop due to the actual contraction of the muscle and the lack of blood flow that's in there. Ultimately, here, what we're trying to do is understand kind of that massive deficit that's going on, and then the recovery rate at which the blood flows back in and the oxygen gets put back into the muscle. And that's talking about oxygen delivery and transport, which is truly essential to understanding the flexibility component into what is going on. And so that, that's not something that we look at here going, oh, well, that's a massive improvement or a massive limitation that we need to identify. But it is a good idea to understand that deficit that's occurring to see how big their contractions are actually taking place in this test, because it should be a very large contraction. With a lot of strength and power athletes, we see larger contractions, and Train Red has really good information around EMG signals and looking at this blood transport chain and the oxygen delivery component, and help us understand what we are seeing is a little bit more accurate into that, but we're not going to talk about it too much today. But ultimately, what we're noticing here is the big thing, right? Improve heart rate recovery across alactic efforts. And then now I'll kind of carry it over to Alex to go, okay, well, now we understand this profiling piece. Now, where does that actually fit from a training recommendation for development standpoint?
Yeah. So like Brett had just mentioned, when we're looking at that test, right, we're trying to identify what is the deficiency. So in this example with this athlete that we're using, we can see that his power output, his power output is good. It's optimal. It is above the weight class average. However, we have to ask ourselves, well, what is that? What is the cost for that athlete to produce that power output? So when we go back and look back at his cardiorespiratory recovery, we see his recovery is really poor. Now with this athlete, if they're lucky enough to get a knockout within the first round, then great. But if we start pushing into those second, third rounds, fourth, fifth championship rounds, and you're not recovering very well, that's bad on you. You know, you're not going to recover well. You're going to fatigue out. Your power output's going to drop. And a lot of times you do see that with certain athletes who have great power output, but then punch themselves out in the fight and get tired. And that's where they get finished. And that's where you see a lot of these finishes. So when we're talking about, again, when we're looking back at what Brett mentioned earlier with the power, capacity, efficiency, with this athlete, just for this specific example, we could look at more of that efficiency piece, being able to continuously produce high amounts of peak power within like that bike sprint, for example, but being able to recover within each of those efforts. This is just an example, y'all, as far as, you know, a sets and reps prescription. I know there's a bunch of different ways to skin a cat when it comes to these types of prescriptions, but you could look at something like I have here, you know, looking at 2 to 3 sets, your rep length, looking at within those 6 to 10 second efforts. We could use, 5 to 10 second efforts using about 6 to 10 reps, working within 80 to 90% of that max alactic power, or that watts that we get from that test. Within that rest period, within that inter-rest period, we could look at a 1 to 5, 1 to 8 work to rest ratio. So there'd be an active recovery piece there. We could also attach a heart rate monitor to this athlete, and during their passive rest session, let's say in between those sets, we're looking at a 5-minute passive recovery, using our heart rate monitor to then track recoverability within that first minute. So, you know, why do we look at within that first minute? Well, we like to think about, you know, each athlete recovering in between 3 rounds, which is a 1-minute rest. So they go for 5 minutes, then they rest, they sit on the stool for 1 minute. And that's the piece that we're trying to tackle here with that efficiency. It's that recoverability aspect of being able to reproduce these high power efforts, but being able to recover from them. So that's that efficiency piece. As far as frequency goes, you know, for this athlete, we're looking at just maintaining. We could try to target this once a week. If we're looking at developing, maybe more than twice a week.
And then we'll funnel into that short-term energy system profiling. So revert to kind of that initial slide of identifying which energy system is the priority. This is our big one, right? So touch on it here. We look at power output. What you saw at the very beginning was an average power output across an entire minute. But we look at 3 time points that are truly essential for the athlete. The first 10 seconds, so think of that true kind of like tapping off that alactic system. The first 30 seconds, so that average of the 30 seconds, and really try to identify, you know, as they get into that glycolytic system, what is occurring, and then how long can they hold on? So looking at the last 30 seconds and where that drop off is, right? So average for the UFC roster is roughly about 55% power drop off from the beginning to the first 10 seconds to the last 10 seconds. This athlete in particular here is a 76% power drop off. Big boy, he can produce a lot of power and efficiency, but the problem is that he can't maintain that across the minute. Pretty much after that 30 seconds is over, he's done, right? We're going to talk about capacity. We have to have the ability to sustain power for that entire minute. I'm not naive to say that we can't, there's no way in hell you can maintain the same power output at the first 10 seconds as you do the last 10 seconds, right? It's impossible. But there is a specific trend line that is going to occur as we extend that minute. And that's what we're trying to understand, is where are they sitting relative to the weight division? And you can really see that here. Is he starting off at around 70, 80% tile, and then he pretty much just slowly starts to deviate away from the average. And that's a big representation of his ability to just not endure and not sustain that power for that entire minute. So glycolytic system really needs some improvements here. We look at the cardiac performance though, you know, right here on this slide. Doesn't cost his heart rate a lot. He recovers really well from it, this being the 1 minute recovery, and then a 2 minute recovery at 24%. Average for our UFC guys across the MGP test itself, that's the short-term power test, is 20%. So he's above the average there, so he's recovering faster. There is some systems that are not working properly, hence why he's not able to maintain the power output. But from a cardiac performance standpoint, he's checking the box that his heart is functioning very well. So he's not overstressing his cardiac system very well, but there are some limiting factors with his respiratory system, which is inability to have this high ventilation threshold, which is extremely important in this test. It's one of the primary components that we're looking at with our respiratory system is how much volume can he truly use and utilize during the actual test. So he's slightly below the average, indicating his ability to kind of use that lung capacity is low. So let's target something along those lines. This is where, okay, breathing mechanics come in. How much is he actually using his diaphragm? How well is he able to perform or maintain high intensities with breathing? Is he out of control? Is breathing frequency high? Those are the questions that we start to really look at when this starts to sit a little bit lower. Metabolic performance, really good. We're looking at VO2, and then we have VCO2. So right at the average for CO2, really what that tells me is there's not an excessive amount of fatigue that's getting built up from a systemic point of view. So he's buffering out something. It's obviously not too much buffering at the musculature level, hence why his power starts to deviate. But from a metabolic standpoint, it's not extremely excessive. So we can't take that box that his metabolic performance is good, and we can actually use this around our programming. So systemically speaking, think of the global body as there's not an extreme amount of fatigue that's getting built up on there. We need to identify where it is actually lacking. And that's where the Train Red devices really start to come in and help us understand is, okay, well, the legs and the arms that are working, there is some residual fatigue that's going on, and that's where you see in the arm here. So at the very end of the test, he's right around 40%, and then within that minute, he's still kind of his ability to deliver and pull that oxygen into his muscles is still decreasing. This is a large problem that we want to address because his body isn't recovering after the effort. So he can produce high power outputs for extended periods of times at certain points, but the cost at which is occurring is extremely high for his muscles. Systemically, he looks pretty good. We can tick all of the boxes pretty much around this component. But when we start looking at the local musculature level, that's when we started to see a decrease. We only has a 14% recovery after 2 minutes. This is something that we have to target a lot on. And that's through local muscular fatigue, hypertrophy type of work, something that will allow fatigue and then the clearance of that fatigue. And then the same kind of concept with our leg. Now, his legs do perform a lot better. He does a lot more running and stationary biking and that, which makes more sense of why he can maintain that from a lower body standpoint, but his arms necessarily aren't as oxidative as his legs. So musculature performance and power output is something that we're going to target. So within that, ultimately, we're looking at this and going, okay, well, we need to focus on capacity because first and foremost, he can't maintain the power output. Now we understand it's coming mainly from the local muscular system. And so Alex will kind of touch on what that actually looks like from a programming standpoint.
Yep. And so just for another example, as Brett mentioned, we're looking at that capacity component. You saw that big drop off after that first 30 seconds and into the last 30 of just his power output starting to decrease. So we want to expand out that capacity. So again, I have another example here. We could use 2 to 4 sets, working for 30 to 90 seconds at 80% of that MGP. So his ability to maintain that speed for a duration of 30 to 90 seconds to help build out that capacity. During that rest period, we do look at an active rest component as well. So a 1-to-1 to a 1-to-3 work to rest ratio. And I kind of want to touch on a little bit of that ventilation and respiratory component that Brett had mentioned. So especially when it comes to breathing mechanics and improving breathing mechanics within our fighters, we know at the end of the day, especially at higher intensities, our athletes are going to breathe how they breathe. But how can we tackle that as practitioners? Well, you can first start when it's like a very low intensity, maybe at the end of the session, working on box breathing. With this athlete in particular, I like to try to tackle it during that active recovery piece. And their passive rest. So, you know, while they're working at 80 to 90%, I'm still cueing them to breathe as efficiently as possible. But again, they're going to tend to breathe how they breathe at those higher intensities. But as practitioners, we can kind of tackle on that active recovery piece. Okay, now I want you to feel your heart. I want you to feel yourself breathing down deep into your belly, and try to work on some of those breathing mechanics to add to that recovery, that recoverability that this athlete is lacking. And again, at that rest period, we can look at around a 3-minute passive rest when it comes to recovery. And then as far as frequency and how often to tackle this, same kind of that maintenance phase, trying to tackle this once a week. We're in that developmental phase, probably 2 to 3 times a week with this athlete.
Yeah, and capacity, the glycolytic system, as some of you may know, is a very, very painful system to train and develop, because it requires a lot of fatigue, and it requires a lot of and like just sheer endurance and grunt work to build up. So this is the least fun type of training you want to do, but it's the most effective, especially with what our guys are trying to work with, right? We have times where it's like, hey, we're going to do this 2 times a week. And the first 3 or 4 weeks is going to be pretty terrible. But as your body starts to adapt and you start getting comfortable, you believe it or not, you kind of start to thrive and like want this type of work, because it's been able to help and move you through. The bike and these intervals are really set so that you can feel the pain and really try to clear it out, but it makes your wrestling and your sparring and your striking so much easier. And that's the kind of the idea is we do a lot of this type of work, this hard stuff, with the bike and with our non-technical work, so that we don't have to burn and be in pain when we do our technical training. That allows them to push their pace a little bit more, makes them to move through it. So, you know, we've been getting a lot of great responses around really trying to prioritize this type of work, especially if it's something that you need to improve, or especially around if you need to prioritize this, as it could be a potential limiting factor for your entire energy system. Last but not least, we have our long-term energy system profiling, which is a pretty typical VO2 max test. We do it on the assault bike. But in a sense, what you're trying to look at is 3 different intensities. We have our low intensity being our VT1. We have our moderate intensity being VT2. So when we cross over to that anaerobic pathway, and then we have our high intensity, which is our max aerobic capacity and power. And really what that tries to help us understand is that true VO2 peak, is what their true maximum oxygen consumption is at that high intensity. What is the power related to that? And are those two intertwined with one another, right? Because a lot of times you can have efficient athletes where they don't have very high aerobic numbers, and they don't have a high VO2, but they can deliver a lot of power output at that zone. So believe it or not, that's a very efficient individual. His liters per minute may be 4 liters per minute, but he's able to push out 800 watts, 900 watts at that higher threshold. That's a very good aerobic intensity, and his ability to endure means he just doesn't have to work as hard to build that up. Is it something that we can improve? Those are conversations that we can really have with the athlete on how that actually looks and ultimately how they recover from that, right? So power output, again, this individual here, very good at low and moderate intensities. But like before on that short-term power, is once he taps into high intensity and he stays there for extended period of time, he really just taps off, right? Same thing with our metabolic. So looking at from the gas exchange, so our VO2 is right at that high intensity, he starts to level off. So he just doesn't have the aerobic power to really sustain that type of effort, even at 8 to 10 minute intervals. Okay, so well, now we start talking about the concept of what's the physiological cost going into that. Ventilation system is in the same exact message as he is with the short-term power. So once he taps into that anaerobic pathway, his O2, his oxygen levels are still increasing, and they're transporting efficiently in his body. It's just not getting, he's not getting more than he expects once he taps over into that anaerobic pathway. So that's when we start to identify that as a limiting factor. Heart rate recovery and performance. Like I said before, his heart is moving very efficiently. That recovery is actually the lowest across the board, around 19%. So long efforts actually have the biggest impact on his cardiac system than any of these short term, these short intensity exposure. So what that tells me is his ability to endure is a little bit low. It's an opportunity for us to improve, but because his short term power was so poor, we were going to target that energy system right there, and we'll actually focus really hard on the active recovery piece during his short term power intervals to build his aerobic system. We'll kind of do it intertwinedly with one another, like we talked about before, that interplay between the energy systems. We can focus a lot on that aerobic system during the recovery modalities by either having them go at these lower moderate intensities and allowing him to work on his breathing or work on his heart rate recovery during that low and active rest, which the idea behind a lot of this is let's be able to produce the power accordingly, but let's reduce the cost that's required to deliver that. And how fast can we repeat that process time and time again? And then the next piece here, which is our muscles. So we're looking at our legs specifically here, right? So his baseline is actually higher than most. So think of 100% oxygen in the muscle. It's more around like 80% here. And then the further you go into intensity, the less oxygen is in the muscle. Ultimately, we want to understand relative to the weight division, how much he's able to produce. And then that's where you see the bigger picture down here. So this isn't the end of the test, right? At this component, this is the end of the test. So his ability to not maintain that high intensity at the high aerobic aspects is something that we want to target. So his muscles are not able to actually utilize the oxygen appropriately at that very, very high aerobic intensity. So that's something that we can target through high aerobic efforts, through sticking around like 90%, 80% VO2 max. If it's like the speed at VO2 max, so think of power output and whatnot. And so the main message here is that we're going to actually target aerobic power for this athlete in that regard, and really try to isolate the musculature system, and then also target a little bit more around that heart rate recovery component. And I'll kind of let Alex touch on that.
Yep. Yeah, guys, just tagging off of what Brett said here. So now looking at that aerobic power. Again, as an example, we can work within 1 to 4 sets of this. As he mentioned, working within that 90% of that VO2 speed for about 20 to 40 seconds for a total of 5 to 10 reps. Again, that rest in between each rep, we can look at around 90 seconds at a specific, maybe it's either at that moderate intensity, so maybe about 50 to 70% of that VO2 max, and then a passive rest period, in between those sets at 2 minutes where they're actually coming off the bike. And again, like I mentioned earlier, we could target something along the lines of that breathing frequency and their breathing mechanics as they're recovering, and then tackling this from a maintenance standpoint, at least once a week. And then from that developmental standpoint, trying to hit that at least 2 to 3 times a week.
Sweet. And then, yeah, it's, so like let's talk about the speed at VO2. I think it is important to like note for a lot of you guys, as I've been talking about the assault bike, and we spend a lot of time in development around our conditioning for the assault bike due to various reasons of just like stress on the joints, very similar, let's call it sport specific movements, and fatigue that they'll get from the musculature system. And that's kind of why we do the assault bike. We can do a lot of and mix these modalities, with a piece of ergonometry that you have, right? Talk about treadmills, rowers. The intensity looks slightly different based off of what you're trying to look at. But to that point is we try to use the assault bike a lot around this type of component, because ultimately we could say, okay, well, your test, your power output is this in the test. Well, let's just do 80%. Let's maintain this type of speed. Let's try to clear out the fatigue and let's repeat this process. And that's kind of the idea that we use in, it just allows for less like stress on the joints and allows for maintaining performance, and then that can carry over to a lot of their training, that they don't feel too fatigued in a sense, because this type of work, you look at it, right? So like 40 seconds of speed at VO2, it's going to be a very difficult task to do, but the fatigue after the fact will be quite low, right? Think of a RPE 7 out of 10, but then you wake up the next morning and you don't even know you did it, right? And that's kind of the idea that we're going for, is we're doing a lot of this type of work, but it should be focusing on the aerobic system where we're not having this guys redlining, trying to develop their aerobic system, which is something that we find very challenging to do because our guys and our culture is full send all the time, and that's how we play. So we're trying to minimize that as much as possible when it's appropriate for development around other energy systems. Because teaching guys how to go hard and go fast isn't something we have to teach very often, but teaching guys how to recover and move at a nice smooth pace around other elements is actually the bigger task that we're really trying to wrap our heads around. So last but not least, kind of the future directions. So you really got to see today around our like our tier 1 profiling. Athlete comes in, they fly in here, they really want to understand kind of their whole baseline performance and where they need to kind of tick the box on their strengths and weaknesses, and then our true energy systems and how it actually interplay with one another and where they need to spend more time at certain intensities, durations, and so forth. But the one thing that we are really trying to focus on now, and we're doing a lot of internal projects around this, is understanding the energy demands and the competition demands of our sport, right? So the one thing that's different for us versus a lot of other sports now is that you guys have GPS monitors that you can wear in training. You can understand the workload that's going on in the game itself. And outside of strikes landed per minute, we're really not understanding what's going on in the locomotion around the fighters in the actual cage, right? You can see the intensity, you can see the impacts in that, but we don't have an objective number at the moment to say, all right, well, these impacts are X amount of G-force, and the heart rate recovery of this exchange is this and that. And so those are the things that we're trying to understand a little bit more of, like, okay, well, subjectively, we can tick a lot of these boxes and understand, well, we know the high intensity exchange takes around 4 to 6 seconds. The average recovery time between exchanges is 28 seconds and so forth. But that's not true, like giving us all the answers that we're trying to understand, right? And so that's where we're trying to understand this through like fight simulations of athletes wearing heart rate monitors and doing these 3 to 5 round sparring sessions and that, and really go, okay, well, our average heart rate on the test is 190, but when we do sparring, it's actually 160. Okay, well, we know we can actually decrease our heart rate training zones a little bit because during their actual sport specific type of work, our heart doesn't really put that much stress on it. Okay, so the intensity is slightly different. Could they be redlining? Yes, but it's a different type of redlining that we're typically looking at. So we want to have those conversations and the understanding of the energy system demands during the competition and the fight that they're going to kind of endure. And then the other piece is that the AI-driven platforms, right? This is huge for us, and it's probably huge for a lot of people. But we have a lot of different systems that we use, right? I talked about Train Red. We have Cosmed using the metabolic, the gas analysis. We have our heart rate monitors. We have the assault bike. We have all these different systems, but how do we get them all in one synchronization piece? Because they don't always talk to each other, right? And how efficiently can we put all this information in one spot and spit it all out and have some objective insights to make and deliver to the athletes? And that's kind of that idea, is real-time feedback is going to be essential for any of our testing, because if we get the results in a week, that means nothing to them. It's in and out of their head. They did the test, they move on. Now the idea is we do the test, we have the conversation, and we put actionable insights into the coach's hands right then and there, and that's something that we're really trying to push towards. And then this concept around targeted systemic versus local muscular development, and Alex can talk a little bit more about this to finish us off, but we have our systemic global metabolism and understanding, but then we have the local musculature development that needs to occur as well. We could be firing on all cylinders for our systemic point of view, but our muscles are still getting fatigued, and they're still not being able to clear that lactate out. And so we need to have a conversation of how we can do that effectively without stressing the other systems that are actually doing just fine. And so we start to have that conversation of what that actually looks like.
Yep. And then kind of like what Brett has already been talking about, I feel like it's super helpful to have those NIRS devices to see what's actually going on in the muscle. But even outside of just our regular conditioning sessions, feel like a lot of that local muscular development can be done through a lot of strength endurance work, whether that be in the weight room. And again, I think that's where that holistic approach comes into play with, S&C and sports medicine and that conditioning piece kind of translating well into the weight room.
And last but not least, thank you. Thank you very much for this, Daniel. This has been actually really cool to kind of give you guys a small insight to what we do here at the UFC, kind of behind all the garage doors and that. So if you guys have any questions or you've accumulated some questions along the way, feel free to fire at us. Maybe.
Or none.
I have a question.
Yeah, go ahead.
So when it comes to, I talked to Dr. French one time, and he said, when fighters typically leave fights, they don't ever say like, oh, I wasn't strong enough, or something like that, or he was way stronger than me, that's why I lost the fight. But a lot of them might say, I wasn't in the best condition for that fight, or my conditioning wasn't there, what have you. Maybe they had a huge adrenaline dump and they weren't performing at their typical like efficiency in their fight economy, I would say. So when it comes to when we're training them in the weight room, so I guess this would be like a little bit more specific for you, Alex. When we're training these athletes in the weight room, does it become the sort of thing where I know it's dependent upon the individual, so I don't want to generalize it, but if we were to say when we're prioritizing these fighters in the weight room and we're developing their energy systems, that takes priority over the resistance training in a way where, like, how would you go about, let's say, prioritizing the energy system development versus like the strength and maybe kind of power development, if that makes sense?
Yeah, no, that definitely does make sense. And that's a really good question. I think that's definitely something as coaches, we try to find a really good balance with, not only because of what we're doing in the weight room from whether a strength and power standpoint or a conditioning standpoint, but it's also really understanding these athletes' schedules and how they work. The thing that's so different about this sport that's different than team sports is that a lot of times with team sports, you're so intertwined with their normal training schedule, you kind of know where you can fit in those conditioning pieces and how those things can work. Whereas with our athletes, a lot of times we try to understand their training schedule. And they might say, okay, coach, yeah, today I have grappling at 10 a.m. I have PT at 11, and then I do S&C at 3, and then I might finishing with a wrestling session. And then by the time I get them in S&C, like, actually, I redlined in grappling today because I just went super hard and I just, got overly competitive, and now I'm overly gassed out. So I think it definitely is what Brett was talking about earlier when it's talking about prioritization. So let's say, for example, with this athlete, I probably am not going to prioritize too much strength and power. Not that he doesn't need it and cannot benefit from it, and that there couldn't be benefits into that conditioning piece. But I would probably place a little bit more prioritization around the conditioning, especially if that athlete is saying, oh man, I'm feeling gassed out. Because at the end of the day, a big determining factor in how well these athletes do, and what we talk about a lot, is their conditioning, is how well they can continue to maintain their power, maintain their endurance through a 3-round or a 5-round fight. So, Noel, just to answer sorry, I had to see your name. Just to answer your question, yeah, it definitely is, dependent on that athlete. But if it is a priority, I would probably prioritize that a little bit more over strength and power. And also depending on how many sessions we might have. So sometimes I'm fortunate where, for example, I had an athlete similar to this profile where he's in here 3 times a week. We spend 2 of those sessions primarily focused on strength and power, and 1 of those sessions prioritizing his conditioning.
Yeah. Yeah, it makes a lot of sense when you break it up that way. Definitely. And I've fought a few amateur, excuse me, mixed martial arts fights. So I definitely understand how variable the training schedule can be. And I feel like as a coach, one of my strengths is that I'm very good at covering the bases of, like, my fighters are doing their plyometrics, they are doing their resistance training. We're covering all bases. We're making sure we're getting, squat, push, pull, hinge. We're doing our plyos. We're jumping. We're moving heavy. We have our power components. I like the Olympic lifts. But then when it comes to maybe, like you said, prioritizing or maybe having an entirely different session for that conditioning. Whereas, so it's not something that takes a backseat like every time, where we might throw that conditioning after the workout, as opposed to making this is our conditioning session. This is what we're going to focus on here.
Absolutely. And that's kind of too where it's like you got to ask yourself like, well, how can I undulate some of those intensities? So if I am mixing my strength and power with my conditioning, okay, well, which one's a prioritization for that day? You know what I mean? Maybe it's the case that your strength and power is probably on your maybe a lower intensity, and then you can prioritize your conditioning, or maybe it's the opposite. Maybe your strength and power takes the priority for that day. You have a little bit lower intensity. Maybe it's either the volume or what your prescription is for that conditioning, but you can still target a little bit of those pieces.
Exactly. So that they're not smoked when it comes to one or the other, you know?
Exactly.
Okay. Gotcha. Thank you very much. I appreciate that.
We got some time, so if you guys
Yeah.
got some questions, yeah, I got some time.
I've actually
Brett,
got a question.
set the best.
Bullshit.
I don't know if someone was gonna ask one there, but no, I love this talk. I really appreciate it. Just some things that kind of get my mind going is how many times are you testing these athletes? And I know it can be variable by how long they're in town for, like kind of what are the number of tests that you're kind of shooting for, or if it's just, you know, something you're trying to profile them and get that that initial measurement. And then another thing I'm curious about too is how you have the averages and the max. Is that like all in-house norms? Is that all like through the UFC Performance Institute? Or are you like aggregating that from other you know, studios or performance centers?
Yeah, so to answer your first question, typically we'll do athletes around like 2 to 3 times a year, depending on the needs of them, right? Obviously, fighters are coming and flying into the PI on their own dime and everything, so it could be once a year that a handful of athletes will do testing. But then the other piece is that we try to target training blocks and kind of competition flow. So, for example, if they get a fight and they're 12 weeks out, they'll come in for diagnostics and kind of get an idea of where they're sitting based off of where their fight camp is going to start, and then what they need to prioritize during fight camp. How much time do they need to spend and prioritize this type of work, or do they need to at all? Can I just do my technical training, do touch on this once or twice a week, and kind of call it good? So it is definitely 100% dependent on the athlete, but typically guys that are engaging with us on a consistent basis, we're seeing about 2 times a year, where they'll come in prior to their fight camp. So a good 8 to 12 weeks out. And then sometimes they'll touch on it a couple weeks after their fight, where they're like, hey, I want to do a really big off season, a really big off camp. What are my true limiting factors? Or is there really anything at all? Like, I felt really gassed out in my fight. Okay, well, I just couldn't control the pace. So there's a different conversation there. So that's what we try to identify there and kind of sit through. We typically have in our tier 1 testing, we have about 12 assessments across our entire PI through nutrition, sports med, strength and conditioning, sports science, about 12 assessments that they'll come in for an entire week for. And then the second question, can't remember it.
He asked about the norms. How do we get the norms?
Oh, the norms. We use so these are all in-house norms, strictly from our UFC fighters. We don't deviate from that at all. And that's way we can compare these athletes against the people that they're going to be fighting. So on average, each weight class has about 30 fighters, and each of them that have completed the diagnostics. And this has been a process that's been started since 2017. We've obviously evolved and changed diagnostics across the board. So some of them started in 22, some of them started when I got here, some of them started prior to me getting here and that type of thing. So we've been able to kind of collect a substantial amount of information. But yes, you're right. It's 100% in-house and all UFC fighters.
This isn't really a question, but Alex, did we meet when I took a tour of the PI?
That's a possibility.
I can't remember for
Sorry,
sure.
brother,
It was
I can't remember.
yeah.
Not to be rude or anything.
No,
But
it's not rude at
yeah.
all. From being in that environment, I could see how you get a lot of people in and out. You know what I mean? Yeah, but I think that you may
if we have,
been
man,
on
it is
before.
it's very nice to meet you again, man.
Same. Very nice to meet you as well. I think you were on the floor when I was there in December.
Got you.
John, did you have a question?
Yeah, and could you touch a little bit more on the AI aspect of what you guys are, specifically using and doing and kind of the deductions that you're getting from, I mean, are you feeding a lot of raw data in and using it to build a bigger picture or
So yeah, so as of right now, we're really just using our AMS platform, which obviously is not a AI driven platform. And that's what we're trying to work with our larger corporation, TKO. We have a data analyst or a data and security team that are trying to build that type of environment out through Power BI, through a couple of different softwares to kind of integrate into our kind of our what we call our TKO data lake, and it spitting out a substantial amount of like forecasting models and that. We've actually been really trying to push around bringing on a lot of interns that have a little bit more of that type of skill set where we can really start to feed and help our corporation team kind of build that type of component out. So like I said, it's something that we're trying to help our team really try to understand and develop. But it is a future direction that we're trying to push and not necessarily where we want it to be, for sure.
awesome? Thanks.
Yeah.
Hey, I just had a quick question. Kind of wondering how you guys have your norms set up throughout the athletes you've worked with in the PI, and wondering how those suggestions might fluctuate based on the type of athlete that you're having, where they seemingly have a predisposition to excel in a particular area of the fight, like thinking of the differences you'd have based on, say, a Nate Diaz versus like a Tyron Woodley, one who's very clearly going to rely on their aerobic power to win fights versus somebody who is almost seemingly never going to bridge that gap as far as aerobic capacity and rely on quick bursts to win fights in a short duration.
Yeah, so to that point, it's when we look at the actual norms themselves, we really base it off of just their overall performance in the testing in that component for sure. But we do sit down and start to dive in and peel back the layers of what type of fighter they are. So like to your point, are they an enduring type of athlete? Are they like this explosive power dominant athlete? And where do they fall within that spectrum of focus? So if they are a self-proclaimed enduring type of athlete where they like to push the pace, they like to advance their opponent, and they like to go really hard the entire time. Think of like Marab, for example. He's a prime example. Doesn't stop at all, full send all the time, aerobic power through the roof. Doesn't have, let's call it, doesn't have like the everything in powerful alactic system potentially, but has that just engine to continue to go and go and go. And then he does our testing, and it's something that he's actually lacking relative to the weight division. We want to complement the type of fighter that he is, and we'll start to prioritize a little bit more of that, especially if that's something that they want to kind of go down. And we have that conversation with a lot of fighters is we sit down and really try to understand their fighting style and what they're trying to look for from us. And then we try to fill those blanks and help us understand, okay, well, this is who you say you are. This is who you are. And if this is the path you're trying to get to, this is what it's going to look like.
Mm-hmm. And I would kind of touch based on that as well, just from a strength conditioning standpoint, is, there's always a bunch of things that I feel like as a practitioner, you can continue to work on. That's why I feel so fortunate to have such a great sports science team and have Brett here to kind of help give us these metrics and targets. And a lot of those deficiencies that, we might highlight from these tests, we might spend a lot of our off camp working in. But a lot of the question that we have to ask ourselves as practitioners is, okay, well, what is your strength? So maybe if we start going into a fight camp, I might not chase a lot of the deficiencies. I might try to keep improving what they're already good at. So when we look at, for example, like this athlete, he was really good at his immediate power output, right? So we could say that's optimal. It's not maximal, but it's optimal. But, if that is something that he relies on, his power going into fight camp, maybe that is something that we continue to improve is his immediate power output. So again, yeah, like Brett was saying, I think it's just important in knowing what to prioritize and when to chase which adaptations.
Alex, Brett, thank you so much for this talk. Really insightful, high level stuff. I do have one final question, unless anyone else has it. You've been mentioning like breath work, in terms of the mechanics and the frequency of it. Is there is there an optimal type of breath work that an athlete can do to improve performance? Like I know you guys have like the whole energy stuff super dialed in, really high level. But like during a match, is there like different breathing techniques that you guys have found for an athlete to recover in those energy systems more effectively?
Yeah, so I'll touch first, and then I know you want to talk about your breath hold stuff because you guys love your breath holds. So think of the diaphragm and the respiratory system. It's like a muscle, like anything else. We have to work on it. And this is actually something that we've been spending a little bit of time internally from like our specific department. And Duncan's been doing a lot too, is a thing called shift wave, where it's a vibration chair, and they do a lot of breath work type of component to stimulate or put it into a recovery modality and just watch your body change its blood flow and vasoconstriction and dilation of the blood vessels in that through this type of breath work. We do it with our altitude chamber as well, and everything is really tied to our respiratory system. So it's kind of it's a nice assurance to say like, okay, yes, if we can control our breathing through various methods of box breathing, if it's 4 inhales, 6 exhales, doing some small breath holds, and that there is not necessarily like a one size fits all approach to this type of like sequence, but it is very similar to that box breathing that you're talking about. Now it's not as it is as simple as like 4-4-4, where you have that inhale, hold, exhale, hold type of component, or it's as similar as it's like understanding how you're responding in that environment through the 3 or 4 inhales and 4-second inhales and then a 6-second exhale. If your body is not capable of handling that through like CO2 buildup, then we start to decrease that duration. It's like, okay, well, then we're going to start with 2 inhale, 2 exhale, and then we start to build that component in those recovery periods. And that's what we've been starting to play with. We haven't really been pushing it a lot to the fighters because we're doing a lot of internal understanding of that through wearing the gas analysis, doing that stuff in and outside of the altitude chamber that we recently got. And it helps us understand the magnitude and the physiological response to doing a lot more breath work there. So a lot of stuff is going down the rabbit hole, but to long story long is really going, okay, well, here's the box breathing type of techniques, starting at small durations and increasing that as their response starts to build up, and there's not that CO2 buildup that we're getting from that component. And so you can talk on some of your stuff.
Yeah, I actually don't have too much to add to what Brett said. I think, like you said, I don't necessarily think that there's one optimal or one better, I guess, way or mechanism when it comes to teaching breathing with athletes. There's a whole bunch of stuff, right? Like I said earlier, there's 1,000 ways to skin a cat. But one of the things that Brett mentioned earlier is this is actually one of our tier 2 tests for SNC. We use a max breathlessness test. And a lot of times when we're trying to look at improving respiratory function, this is the test that we like to use. So the way that we set this test up is we have our athletes, well, for us, we have them start on the turf. We have them do like 2 deep inhales, exhales. And then on their 3rd inhale, we have them big inhale, plug their nose, hold their breath, and we count the amount of steps that they can take within that test until they absolutely have to breathe. And so what we're assessing there is like what Brett had mentioned, CO2 tolerance and our body's ability to withstand CO2 tolerance, or at least get used to it and utilize the remaining oxygen in your body. So just for some normative data from us, a big tick on the max breathlessness test is usually around 80 steps. So I challenge everybody on this webinar to do it yourself. It is just take a big inhale, plug your nose, hold your breath, and count how many steps you can get. And again, once our athletes are able to hit 80, we can then kind of progress into maybe our next technique, and that might be breath holds with sprint intervals or rowing intervals. Again, challenging that respiratory function and their breathing mechanics. So I challenge you guys, definitely take a stab at it and let me know what you guys get.
Brett and Alex, how many steps can you guys get in?
When I did it last time, I think I'm at 64 steps.
This is one of those things where I don't believe in anything. I'm just kidding. Because I last about 10 steps. Because I have no ability to hold my breath. For whatsoever reason.
I'll say one of my best athletes, they can get around like 120 steps. That's probably one of the better ones that I've seen with one of my athletes that I work with.
I'm gonna try it and I'll let you know because I used to be a huge free diver. So at one point I could hold my breath for 5 minutes. So I might be able to beat that.
That's a perfect type
That's
of training
great.
modality for
Yeah.
you right there.
Then you can work into underwater breath work. Well, awesome, guys. Thank you so much, y'all, for taking the time to have Brett and I come on today and speak a little bit about what we do here with energy system profiling. Daniel, I don't know how you send out information, but you're more than welcome to, if you're cool with that, share.
Yep, put me on the spot. Yeah, you can
share Brett's personal number so you guys can personally text him.
Please don't text me. But you can email me. I'll give you my email, I promise.
And if you guys are in college or looking for internships, we do have internships here at the UFC with our sports science department and strength conditioning department. You do have to be enrolled in school. That is a big thing. And unfortunately, you do have to be based here in the United States as of right now. But if there are any students on this webinar that are interested in it, please take a look. Please get a chance, take a look, apply. We'd be happy to talk to you guys about it.
And the summer internship, the deadline for submissions actually ends next Friday. So if you want a summer internship, it is paid. So that's better than most colleges. So that'll help you out there. It's not much, but it's something.
Yeah.
It's something that's not free work. So you'll be able to get a little bit of money in your pocket as well. So just food for thought.
Awesome. Thank you, guys.